Good evening, everyone. We are so happy and elated to have a very special guest with us on this evening in the person of Ambassador Cindy Corville. As many of you have heard her speak last year, and we thoroughly enjoyed hearing from her. We are blessed to have been able to get her once again, so she will be speaking to us again. Ambassador Corville served during the Bush administration. We call him Dad Bush, Son Bush, and she was a political uh, ambassador to the African Union. And on a personal note, I am so happy because sister Ambassador Corville is a very pleasant person. She is delightful. I have had the opportunity to have had some conversations with her. We've chatted on the phone, and every time I come off the phone, I always tell my husband, she's so sweet. She's a sweetheart. I love talking to her. So we had spent time talking about how we spent, during the pandemic, some of the things that we were doing to kind of keep our minds occupied. We've talked about some political things. We've talked about personal things. So I am so happy we have developed this friendship. And if you want to know even more about her, I actually interviewed her for Conversations with Lady Pruitt for the month of November. So you can actually go on our website or go on YouTube, and you can actually listen to the conversation that we have, and you'll learn a lot more about her and about the work that she did, about her upbringing. It was really, really great interview that I had with her. And then even afterwards, we had a great time just chatting together. So I'm going to ask that you listen attentively today as I present to you at this time, Ambassador Cindy Corville. God bless you, Ambassador.
Thank you so much, Pruitt. It is indeed a pleasure. And as I see a blossoming friendship, and thank you for all the kind words. And I'm going to try to live up to all of those. I am still very much a work in process. And I think that is part of the learning experience. So for today, the particular subject matter that I want to discuss with you is the Republic of Haiti. And we're talking about multiculturalism. And sometimes in the US context, we think of it as Black and white, or maybe a few other different groups. But knowing that multiculturalism is throughout the world, there are few places who are untouched or that are one unit of an ethnic group or racial group. And as we've seen the progression of time, human beings move around the planet. Whether sometimes by choice and other times because they were conquered, enslaved, or part of a working group and famine in their country, as the Irish who left their country to survive with the potato famine. So let's look at Haiti in terms of its history. Most certainly, Haiti has what we know today as having a Black, quote unquote, Creole population. What does that mean? That means that 95%, based on DNA testing, not about what your skin color is, or what you look like, or where you think your grandparents may have come from. But today with science, we are able to actually genetically say where someone comes from, what's your origin. So within Haitians, Black Haitians' DNA, 86% have an African heritage, lineage. About 12% have roughly, excuse me, a European heritage, another 2% a Native American. And Native American is both North and South, but primarily South as this occurs. So when we start to, and that for me was also a fascinating thing to look at, what is the ancestry genetically? And some of you by now have also done your DNA ancestry and can begin to say regionally or geographically where we come from, who we are. You may not know the names of everyone, and as more Africans and other people around the world take the test, we actually can say which group of people we come from. I had my brother to do that. So that just gives you a little concept. That's something I hope you will take away beyond Haiti with this. So who was there before the Africans came? There's a group of indigenous, the Tenwa or Taino people who were Arikot people who were indigenous to the Caribbean before we saw an African population. And their first contact was around the late 15th century. So before we say African descendants or an Afro-Haitian community, there was an indigenous group there. Before Columbus came to Haiti and to the Americas, there was, so what we call the Greater Antilles. So in Cuba, Jamaica, and Haiti, we saw these indigenous people who across these island nations, cross-pollinated, if you want to say. And there were basically, I would say, 3 broad groups. So if you pull up on Google on the side and just kind of look at a map, I didn't want to do too complicated because I think we all know where Haiti is. But if you're curious, you can pull up the map and see that Cuba, the Bahamas, Hispanolas, and most certainly Puerto Rico, all of these places we look at. And of course, the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And why do we have one island with 2 nations? A simple thing like that. And you go like, well, wait a minute, how is that possible? Well, let's jump forward and talk about Columbus and the colonization of this part of the world. Different, France and Spain were competing. And they carved up that small island. And so this is why you have a Spanish-speaking and a French-speaking entity in that complex. So just to understand that just little tidbit of history, I hope gives us a perspective. But I also want to have a footnote, probably a big footnote. The enslavement of African people wasn't all due in part to Europeans coming and taking them away. It was also a collaborative endeavor between African political leaders, empires at the time, and who sold off their peoples because, okay, this was my enemy. Easy way not to have an enemy, put them on a ship. And this was not unique to Africans. We saw this in other parts of the world where they did the same thing. If you could have a way of disposing of those who were involved. But it also was a profitable endeavor for many African political leaders. So a combination of factors. So when I look back at enslaved people, no, it wasn't your choice. It wasn't one group, but it was a trade relation. It was profitable for both sides at the time. I would say to now the chagrin of African political leaders who sent some of their best and brightest away and depleted a large labor force on their own continent. And today we're seeing some of the detriment of that and taking a responsibility for being part of. But let's go back to Haiti and look at that in turn. And so I don't want to dwell too much on the history, but just to give you a context of what that island, was about, and that prior to the colonization, what is known as Haiti and the Dominican Republic, there were roughly about 5 different kingdoms, small kingdoms, empires, believe it or not, on one island. But in this case, vying for power. So there were 5 chieftains who competed for power, which made it pretty easy for an external power coming in to divide and conquer. So political reasons, not ethnic reasons, not racial reasons, but these political leaders were viable in their own right. Now, let's say you have an external force, in this case, both Spain and France coming in with a more sophisticated weaponry, also came in initially as traders, looking at resources. So each kingdom was trading. I'm saying initially, this started out as a more or less equal relationship until we see a change in dynamics, until the external power coming in realize it has the military capability to conquer the group successfully. And that's what both the Spanish and the French were able to do. So within a short period of time, what happened was that you divide this between the French part and the Spanish part, creating two different colonies. Well, you said, well, wait a minute, how is this possible? Well, it was called, before this, in Africa, you get later the scramble for Africa, and the European countries made the scramble, which is in the same situation we see apparent, where you have French-speaking, only one Spanish-speaking country in Africa, Equatorial Guinea, and then Portuguese, and of course, English-speaking. But on this small island, we are dominated by the French and the Spanish. Well, you said, well, what's happening? Well, this is before we have, quote unquote, a United States to come into play. But Haitians, both indigenous and those who were part of an enslaved people, quickly, and I have to put this into play, quickly learned to fight for their own freedom. And that becomes, rebellions were constant on both sides of the island. Individuals who wanted to be liberated, individuals who had been enslaved, seeing the possibilities. And that's important for us to be aware of. But just because you come from the same ethnic group does not mean that you have the same political agenda. As we know, even as African Americans, not all of us have the same political ideological orientation. Not all of us have the same economic end goals or social end goals. At the end of the day, we're all human beings, but our culture does shape us. And most human beings, and probably a unique handful, are destined to be leaders, or are willing to take the risks, the responsibilities, not always capable, but have the chutzpah to say, I want to lead because no one else has stood up. And we're seeing some of that in the United States, again, raise its head. Some of those who are more capable leaders are not willing to step forward. Others who see the vacuum are willing to step in. So from that perspective, I think it's very important to note what has taken place. And when you look at that in terms of leadership, what happened that made that change in leadership? Why do we suddenly, and I say suddenly because suddenly in history is a short, could seem like a long period of time, but in reality is a very short period of time. And when you start to look at that, when the shift comes, and it was the first independence in 1791, and that was Toussaint Louverture, who came to power, who brought independence to this side of the island, the French side of the island. And that he took office in 1791. For almost 11 years, he ran that country, brought in democratic ideals, went from enslavement to paid labor. Now, what a unique, and it shouldn't be unique. Look, democracy does not belong to Europeans. I know I'm stating the obvious, but sometimes we do have to state the obvious, because there were African empires before there was the United States of America. The empires of Mali, the Ashanti, the Axum, all of these empires existed in place. And like any empire, when it fails to take care of its people, when it fails to do these kinds of things, is doomed to fall. So the exchange between the Greeks and the Egyptian empire, with the Nubians, because there were dark-skinned Egyptian rulers, who we never hear anyone talk about. And who suddenly get erased and get paler and paler. Well, you can be African not just by the color of your skin. So if you know your history, and most of us, including myself, you didn't get this in school. You had to go and look for it. We don't get our American history in a school, let alone understanding about others. So that old adage about the victor writes history, yes. And if you don't have the power to win, you tell your story, not the other person's story. We are at a point in American history where we're trying to get the whole story told. And there is a reason that others don't want it, because do I lose my place? No, you don't. We become greater as a people when we can identify, but that's a hard fought process. And first you educate yourself and then you pull the others along. So if we can't talk about our own history, and the same case could be said of Haiti. So when we're talking about Toussaint Louverture, it is important to note that when he came to power, that was defeating, a military defeat of the French. And he established an independent party. And so he was the leader of the Haitian Revolution. And so from that perspective, to have someone go from enslaved to leading, this is a fairly, if not formally educated individual, but someone who learned. You don't always have to have a degree. Degrees are important. There are signs that you can set, but a well-read person, and that's by choice, is so important when you have access to information. So from that perspective, you say, what happened to the indigenous group? Well, how many of them survived? Not many did, whether from disease or extermination, and bringing in a different labor force, because some of the indigenous populations weren't willing to succumb to enslavement. No one by choice does. You do it for survival. And there are choices. Do you throw yourself off the ship? Do you commit suicide? Do you fight to the death? Or do you live to fight another day? And all are valid choices to make. So no one is a less valid choice than the other. And I think we have to respect those individuals who make those kinds of decisions. And so with that in mind, we go from, after Overture was actually taken by the French in a proposed meeting and sent back to France so that they could regain control. And we go from, because he also wanted to be president from life. So democracy went one way, which is always the danger for any political leader. And I can say, I've seen, and probably in our history or others, but in my recent history, I was afraid when Nixon was thinking about, oh my God, with Watergate, is Nixon going to call, a unilateral approach and take, control of the government? But I was confident enough in our military that they weren't going to allow it. And the next time I got scared was with President Trump. And most certainly January 6th, there were red flags from day one. And he didn't hide anything, that any leader who thinks that he is better or more capable than the people of the country to govern alone and to walk away from democracy. Steve Bannon was clear. This is where you have to read and listen to things you don't want to read and don't want to listen to, because Steve Bannon to this day was clear. He wanted to tear down the American democracy that we know today, because the average American couldn't make the decisions that they needed to make. And we didn't want to hear it. And those who voted for Steve Bannon never listened to Steve Bannon, never recognized that every talking point came right out of his mouth in President, Trump. And no democracy is invulnerable. And we are teetering to this day. So citizen responsibility. So look at Haiti. This is where you can go to worst case scenario, because you do have a collapsed state. What do I mean by a collapsed state? Failed. You have no real government over probably, I would say, the last 20 years. It's been a failed state. We just don't want to call it what it is. And it is in our own backyard. And technically, based on the Monroe Doctrine, which split the world in half, Europeans were to stay in Africa and parts of Asia, and the Americas belonged to the United States. So those quote unquote banana republics where Dole was in South America and, in Central America and in the Caribbean, the US has played a long, has a long history there. And the Haitians thought there was a better relationship to be had with the Americans than with. And notice, we call only the United States Americans. That's still a big issue for Latin America and Central America, because they're all the Americas. But we, as a global superpower early in our time, and then a regional power at the time, made claim to that title alone, because we called ourselves the United States of America. And with that in mind, what happens to Haiti? Well, what we saw from 1791 to the first emperor, who became in Emperor Jacques in 1758 to 1806. And then you had a divided Haiti and the Kingdom of Haiti. You see how the power politics, remember there were 5 kingdoms prior to the French coming through. So there was a historical vie for power. And that indigenous group was also a component, but for the most part were relegated to lesser power positions unless there was intermarriage across groups. This was important to note. And the French influence maintained itself. And it isn't until 1806 that we get the Republic of Haiti. So going from an empire to a republic is a major political shift in power. Why is that important? Because it meant that the people were supposed to have more of a say and not just one leader. But note that if you see anything, that French influence is still overriding all the way. Then we go to 1848 and we go back to an empire, because in an empire, one leader, an emperor, has total control. How can I put it? Divine right. God has destined you. Notice that the Queen of England is chosen by divine right. All kings and queens have said that God has made them there. Well, I don't know which God they heard, or one God, depending on your attitude. But if you can make that claim and you can convince people to believe, then it is possible. And people believe what they want to believe. No matter what region, whether you're Haiti, the United States, or Nigeria, or France, or Germany, Japan, the average person wants to take care of their family, have a comfortable living, live a good life, have friends, do all these things and progress. And most of us don't want to be responsible for government, right? Pass it on. But we expect that people will protect us. And I think the last time I talked to you, I talked about you get the government you deserve. And that sounds kind of harsh, because if you don't put anything into it, you will get exactly what you deserve. If you don't hold leaders accountable, you get what you deserve. And so while there were no surprises for me that Trump won, people didn't want Hillary. There are no surprises in Haiti of the overturn of one political leader after the other. And formal education or lack thereof is no excuse for your responsibility in government. Not all of enslaved people in the early years could read and write, but you could understand and reason. And now that we have and it's still a luxury, the ability to read and write and comprehend, or as some of my aunts and uncles and teachers would say, you were calling words, but you had no idea what those words meant. That's called comprehension. And making sure that we understand what the words mean and how they are used is a powerful tool that actually no one can take away from. And some of the Haitian people, I don't want to blame them, but have abdicated that right or responsibility. Or even when they didn't have the opportunity, they let it go. And it's a small island, but you say, okay, compare it to the early Hawaiians and what happened to them. Same difference with Haiti, except the United States incorporated, annexed, made it part of the states. Why haven't we done that with Puerto Rico? That's a whole nother story. we'll come back. But I want to tell you, one leader after the other, we saw this overturn of regime. The country remained Haiti. When you get into the early 1800s, you see a distinction from empire to president. But if the same political structure is in place, it doesn't really matter. So when do we begin to see a change? My God, it really, really doesn't start until we get into the early 1900s that we see a political shift. Roughly about 1907, Francois Duvalier. And you look at this family comes the National Unity Party. So you have a leader who arises to say, look, we have to make a shift here, people. We're independent. But we're supposed to be independent, but we are still economically dependent. And if you can't control your resources, you can't be independent without the economic wherewithal. That goes to say whether you are a nation state or an individual, let alone a group. So we go from the individual to the group to, in our case, or in their case, to state and local, and then you go to the national. If you're economically dependent on someone else, you have very little say in what you're going to do as a country. If you have nothing to leverage. So here we go with Haiti, who did have resources, but like most of the island countries and most countries who have been colonized, they were dependent on trade with their former colonizer. And a nation who cannot feed themselves cannot be independent. The United States found that out with COVID, big time. When you are importing your foods, when you're importing your technology, you are not independent. While militarily, we are a superpower. If the semiconductors you need are produced by your enemy, China, you are not independent. Okay. So, and this is lessons learned. Haiti right now is not capable and hasn't been capable for a long time, and I'm just making historical leaps here, of economic independence, clean water, healthcare, all of the basics that we take for granted. I give my birth state of Louisiana after a hurricane. When you don't have clean water or running water or electricity today, look what happens when our power grids don't work. So can you imagine being in Haiti in physical structures that can't sustain them? This is the kind of thing that we see in place. And so from that perspective, I think it's important. I don't want to inundate you with tons of history, because I want you to be able to go back and take a look and see what has happened in that country over time. So go from 1791 to 1986, we see a dynasty controlling the country, one family after the other. And even today, families who had formerly, in many countries been apart, and I've seen this in Africa too, now are cross-marrying to come back into power. And look, what do we do in this given situation? We also have a problem when you're a failed state or a collapsed state, that Haitian gangs have as much power or more power than the government. And there's an irony here. Well, the most recent assassination on July 7th, 2021, of President Morsi, who was assassinated in his private residence. Now, how do you get assassinated in your private residence unless your own security has been co-opted and compromised? And what was going on that this president was doing that was such a threat? And who was threatening him? His own cabinet members are either head a gang or are behind the scenes in a gang. Because everybody wants to be president. And why do you want to be president? It is for the good of the people? No, it is for you to acquire wealth. And in countries like Haiti and parts of Asia, parts of Africa, Latin America, presidents who have come to power, and oh, by the way, parts of Eastern Europe as well. This is not uniquely a third world issue. So this is about human beings wanting to acquire power, is that you see the state as a place, your own private banking system, to put it in very, everyday terms, because you can generate revenue. Afghanistan is a perfect example of that, with the recent collapse of the leadership there, who the president, who had been elected with US support, got on a plane with his family and closest cohorts and took US dollars, hard currency, with him till money was falling out of, the container of the plane as it took off. So corruption is not unique. We have corruption here. Every country has, and this is sounding again like an oxymoron, levels of acceptable corruption. Blue collar corruption is different than white collar corruption. Note that we have prisons in the United States where white collar crimes go into very nice, Martha Stewart went into a very nice, prison. Didn't hurt her economic career at all, probably enhanced it. And then you go to the blue collar prison where it's like, okay, I'm going to be in here for life. I'll never be able to get a job. I won't be able to vote. These are the differences. And unfortunately, we see them cross ethnic lines. So that's another discussion for you. But look at this President Morsi, who was just elected, ready to take a chance on moving forward. And it's daring when you want to say, I'm going to try and do the right thing in the midst. He was shot dead inside his home. Happened about 1 o'clock in the morning. And you would have to have the logistics to get into his home. You would have had to get through all of the security. And the people who attacked him were dressed in security guard uniforms. His wife was flown to the United States and fortunately has survived. But you now have a country, once again, it was already in the state of chaos. But once again, one of the gang leaders, what's his name? Jimmy, his label is Jimmy Barbecue, Cherise, born in 1976 or 77, head of what's called the G9 gang. And why is that important? Well, this guy, if you just Google Jimmy Barbecue and you see him, sometimes he's in a suit, sometimes he's dressed in fatigues with, you know, an M16 or something comparable. His political pictures reminded me of Virginia's now Lieutenant Governor-elect's campaign picture, if you see her with the gun in her hand. And I'm not anti-guns, but it just is the image of your political leader coming on board and happening, in my case, to be the first African-American to be elected as lieutenant governor in Virginia. And I hope she proves me wrong. We also have the Director General of the Ministry of Interior who supports the gangs in Haiti, a different one. We have another one who, Joseph Richard Duplan, who was the department, how can I put it, the departmental delegate at the time of the assassination, who was said to be the intellectual architect. So this was truly a coup d'etat. January 6th here could have been, well, was a failed coup d'etat. It was not a riot. Insurrection is putting it mild. Had this happened in any other country, we would have called a spade, and it's a coup. So a failed coup. So what I'm looking at here is for you to hopefully understand the power politics, the vie for power. And you said, what is there in Haiti? So think of it, COVID is rampant. 2 earthquakes within a short space of time. Infrastructure totally destroyed. The gangs control the ports. So any of all of those resources that we are sending, and I know your church has contributed on multiple levels to support, you know, the victims of the earthquake and hurricanes in Haiti. And I'm hard pressed to tell you, most of that stuff probably isn't getting through. Because if the missionaries can't cross the roads, drive up, and when you see the visuals of buildings still damaged, of an already impoverished country, not having the ability to rebuild, let alone grow your crops, or running water, or sanitation. And I'm not saying this to make you feel bad or to say, let's just forget it. But what can be done has to be first done by Haitians. If they can't create the environment for missionaries or for the USAID to come in to support, and you're going to get what we call in quotes, donor fatigue. How many times can we give if we don't see the political will? Not so much of the people, but the leadership. But people play a role too. You can go from being internally politically fatigued and repressed. And I can only imagine generation after generation of Haitian people saying, what can we do? Of feeling hopeless. Of course, I believe in God and, you know, helping yourself. But when you look around and the odds seem so impossible to overcome, and at what price tag, either you just acquiesce or you say, I'm going to fight, and knowing that most of you aren't going to survive. That's a hard-fought position. Enslaved people experience that everywhere they've been enslaved. And it has nothing to do, well, race can be a factor, it can be a layer, but even in places in Roman times where you enslaved other Europeans across the board, enslaved people either decide to fight back, give up their life, or acquiesce and hope that things get better. What I hope gets better is human beings, but I'm cautiously optimistic about that. Look, there are police checkpoints in the areas where gangs are. What are you going to do when the gangs outgun you and you're at the police checkpoint as a police person? The power of these gangs has only grown over time. And what has diminished over times is the political infrastructure and a political leadership. And I'm also going to say the will of the people to see a way out. If you can't see a way out, it's kind of hard to move forward. So divine intervention. Look what happened recently in April, the kidnapping of 5 priests and 2 nuns by the gangs and holding them hostage. $1 million ransom for each. What missionary wants to go in again, even though they may want to, but the cost? And they figure Americans are going to pay it. And look, I'm going to say the audacity of the gang leaders to get on YouTube and Twitter and announce that they're doing this. And I'm going like, not a good strategic move, because we know who you are. And, or you figure we are not coming. So the question is, are 5 American lives worth going in with the military? Yes. Are we going to do it? No. Okay? No, we are not. And so I have nothing but really, how can I say it? Respect for missionaries who go knowing you don't have all of those protections, but you have the most important protection, you have God. And so your faith is what makes you go. And your faith is what makes you want to give. Your government has to weigh some other things. What happens if we go in? And if we go in, we own it. And if you look at what's taken place with Afghanistan, and we didn't go into Haiti because Haiti is not seen as a national security priority. What have you got to offer us? If we needed to take you over, we would. Is it worth taking over? And I'm being hard-nosed here, so I'm not going to say forgive me, but understand. You have to weigh where you intervene. If we're going to pull out of Afghanistan, are we going to go into Haiti? No. If we say that we value the lives, but if Haitians, just like Afghanis, didn't value their own state, and this is Ambassador Corville talking, I won't speak for President Biden. If you are not willing to do what you need to do, and I thought he was right in leaving, because after 20 years of investing, you are not willing to do what you need to do, we don't need to be there. And after more than 20 years of investing in Haiti and a political leadership not willing to do what it needs to do, why should we continue to invest in you? I would argue we need to invest more in Mexico, because that neighbor is attached to us. That neighbor has direct value. We invest with Canada, but we don't invest enough with Mexico. And Haitians are going into other island hopping through Latin America, up through Central America, coming into the United States. Note, they are not called refugees. Your political label, they're called Haitian migrants. So we're putting you on a plane and sending you back. If you had come across, I know this is hard and it seems harsh, but when you're in that room and whoever is our senior leadership at the National Security Council is saying, you know what, I see the humanitarian issues, I can put them on the table, I have to find a way to justify the political, but if the leadership in Haiti doesn't give me something to lift with, it's hard for me to go into that national security meeting and say why we need to be there and why we need to put more resources. So you're going to send the head of USAID, Samantha Powers, who is a fabulous and outstanding, woman, and whose heart is in the right place, but you make it hard for her. Once you have been called a humanitarian disaster and situation, you are not a same political importance. If you were a national security risk and importance, your value goes up here. But humanitarian, it's a good thing to do, but it's not going to protect the United States. So I say that to you to understand Haitians have to be on the forefront. And if they are not on the forefront of doing what needs to be done, at great risk to their own. Look at this president who was assassinated in his home. And he was attempting to make the right steps, but it is more profitable for the gangs to have a puppet president, for the gangs, not for the people of Haiti. And so from that point, there is no functioning government in Haiti to this day. And perspective, probably in the last 10 to 15 years. And the US political leadership has been reluctant to call it a collapsed state, but they keep saying it's a humanitarian relationship, not a political rebuilding, not an economic investment. We've addressed hurricanes, we've addressed, as I said, COVID, and the Trump administration did not. And they would see it as, we can afford to let it collapse. It's already collapsed and we don't need to do anything about it. And if there's another Trump administration, it's going to get a whole lot worse. And there is the possibility of another Trump administration. So that's my political analysis there. So could I open it up, Lady Pruitt, if you don't mind, for discussion and questions? I just wanted to give you an overview, and I can go into much more detail if you would like in different areas.
Mr. Randolph, go ahead. I saw your hand.
I have more just a comment this afternoon, Ambassador, rather than a question. I just we were discussing at work about the assassination of the president, and I just thought it was good that you brought that out, because that was some of the things that I brought out in the meeting that we had, that the gangs had to be in coordination with the security of that president. In my military career, I've worked with different countries, and I know how serious they are about the security of the president. So I know there had to be a coordinated effort to do that, and like you said, inside of their own home. So I thought that was good. But also, too, while you were talking, CNN report just came out that 2 missionaries were just released from Haiti. So that just happened 5 or 10 minutes ago. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, that is outstanding news. Did they mention whether a ransom was paid or not?
No, ma'am, I did not read it because you were talking. I'll read it at the church.
No, that is good news. And I had to go back and look at, let's say, we've had at least 15 Haitian presidents who were assassinated over time. So no, thank you. That's some good news. So hopefully we've had someone who's intervening. If we were even more hard-nosed as a country, we would send no humanitarian relief. Now, you're going to take a hit, sir, as you know, either way you go. So if we would have to say, you demonstrate, and if we were really hard-nosed, we would send no COVID relief, no running water, nothing, and let it fall in chaos. And in some ways, we are doing that not intentionally, but we're giving more of a Band-Aid, because the people as a whole and those gangs have said it is more important for my personal interests than for the greater good. As I'm also noting, in America, we're forgetting about the greater good instead of the self. You know, the self is more important than the greater good. And so in this case, it is understandable. Now, unless the missionaries paid a lesser amount on their own, and it probably will take us a little bit of a time to find out what exactly, whether a ransom was paid or not. So thank you so much for that update.
Okay.
Good evening, Ambassador. I always enjoy you. I always do.
Thank you, sir.
I have to put up with my wife. Every sentence you say, she's saying, "Amen." Go ahead. It's hard, but anyway, I saw a documentary. I think his name was Henry Louis Gates,
Yes.
the Black professor, and he talked about being Black in Latin America. And he presented a case where when the Black Haitians overthrew the governing Europeans, that the United States, if you will, stepped in and orchestrated blockades and embargoes, kind of helped rally other European nations to make Haiti an example to other Caribbean nations, and so at what point do we delineate between the United States enforcing or contributing to Haiti's demise, and at what point do the Haitians bear their own burden for not standing up to corruption and etc.?
No, that's excellent. Thank you, Pastor, for that. I would have to say that it was a direct threat when enslaved people in Haiti overthrew the colonizers. You could have that infection come to the US and embolden those who find out that news, that it is possible to overthrow. Since we had many enslaved people who rebelled and fought for their freedom in the US. So you didn't want to have that precedent set. So we had, going back to the Monroe Doctrine, we were really clear about our sphere of influence. We were also thinking that we didn't want to take that over. And since the French had been sorely defeated, we'd have to say, who can we work with? But it really was a direct threat to then a young United States, that you're going to have this leader or group of people who could organize half of an island to rebel, which meant that the other half, the Spanish side, was also threatened if they decided to do that as well. So yeah, it was a direct threat. But remember, while US had gained its independence, was still a young nation when Levant Overture came to power in 1791. And you're like, wait a minute, that's just across the water. We aren't this grand nation state. So I think from that perspective, what would have that meant for trade engagements? But the greatest threat is that you would hear politically, the news would travel that they had ousted an entire colonial power at that point to gain control, and we would have to engage, and you would see those leaders coming here or trade partners. The economic threat was more overwhelming than the political, although I would say they go hand in hand. So that's an outstanding. And the Europeans were still our allies. And remember, the French had helped us with our own revolution. So we owed a debt to the French to support them in this particular case as well. So thank you. Excellent question, sir. Other questions, comments? Please don't be shy. We're open for discussion. Yes, is that Jeff?
Yes, ma'am. Ambassador Corville, just like to get your opinion on this. What do you think it would take for the Haitians to take over their country again? Other than these gangs, because it seems kind of hopeless at this point.
Yes, that I have to say, part of me really sees the hopelessness. Because when you see the images of the people, and I'm always believing it is possible, it would take what we call political will. It's not going to be easy. It means even the average Haitian who has little or nothing has to stand up. And we've seen this happen in countries time and time again, where the people said, I've had enough with the gangs. And it means you're probably going to give up your life, or quite a few of you, in order to fight them, or to at least have the political discussion with them to say, you could be far more powerful if you put the guns down or become part of the establishment and the reform. Because this island, this half of an island with climate change, cannot sustain itself. And I think you're going to see an increase in migrants fleeing, because the island itself is going to become, without hard work, inhabitable. If there is no further maintenance of an already very fragile, let alone rebuilding of an infrastructure for fresh water, of a farming capability to feed its people, a lack, I'm just saying a total lack of a medical infrastructure, people will continue to flee and take all the risks of hopping on little boats to go to the next island, knowing they can't stay, and then getting to the larger South American continent. And they're going to be pushed and pushed until they come through Central America back up to us. Long-term sustainability, if climate change, as predicted, will have the kind of impact, those people are going to be forced to leave that island anyway. But in the short term, you could stave off and say, let's work with the US. Let's work with the UN. Let's rebuild. But we know that other force, which we have chosen to not do such a good job on climate change, is going to directly have the largest impact on island countries, mostly third world people, who are going to be devastated in the coastal areas. And so I think we can stave it off in the short term if the conversations among the gang leadership, pirates became political leaders, no matter what ethnicity when they got on an island. So crooks can become good leaders if they choose to make that conscious shift and find out that it's far more profitable for everyone to move away from that kind of, robbing people. And basically they've become modern day pirates on land and sea, taking over goods coming in at the ports, charging taxes. If earlier I said there are levels of tolerable corruption, I might have to pay a little more tax to get my stuff in. Okay. Now we have that here in the United States. If you're part of the Teamsters Union and blah, 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 you might see, we don't see it, we don't hear about it, but you know about those informal kinds of agreements and who gets to work where. But the Haitian leaders who are educated, many of them have chosen, these aren't uneducated individuals who are leading, who have chosen to go this route because they didn't want to educate their people enough and to consciously think of themselves first. That's a horrible thing for me to say, but that's what I see. I don't know if I've really answered your question, Jeff. I hope I've touched on it a little bit.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Right, Sister Delia Pruitt.
Yes.
Ma'am, you may have already hit this, but I think I have to hear it again to process, because in my mind, when you're describing the conditions, why are we calling them Haitian migrants again instead of refugees is my first question.
Mhm.
And my second question is, like, I hear when you were kind of describing the climate, not the, you know, temperature climate, but like the, you know, the overall climate in Haiti, like, is the onus on the innocent citizens to, you know, create this infrastructure? And because in my mind, when you were kind of, you know, laying it out and giving us information, it sounded a lot like the ghettos and hoods in the US and the rhetoric in the 80s and 90s where they were told, well, we heard a lot of black on black crime. Well, if they would just clean up their streets and get out of those gangs and get their education, and it wouldn't have to be a hood. But there were factors involved that got them there. So is the onus, how much of the onus is on the people to fix themselves when they weren't the ones that necessarily invited that corruption or that colonization and that colonial exploitation? Like, what? So the question may have already been asked, the question may have already been answered, but my brain is trying to process it outside of the context of the parallels of that rhetoric we heard in the 80s and 90s of the US, like the war on crime, the war on drugs. Like I hear a lot of parallels in that rhetoric and language, and I don't think that, maybe I just want to make sure I'm understanding it correctly.
No, thank you very much. And let me give you a point of clarification, and I'll start with, I am not blaming the victim, but you can choose to be a victim up to a point. There is a price. That's a hard thing to hear. Trust me, I know. And I hate using that language, but if, according to the UN, 24.7% of Haitians live in extreme poverty, that is less than $1.25 per day. So even with poverty in here, and I'm not saying one is worse than the other, but over time, people can get beat down so far to extremes of repression. You can go down so far that you feel hopeless and helpless. And I think we've seen a population who just don't see a way out, a sizable portion. There is another portion of that population which, since its independence in 1791, have continued to fight for change. But you also then, again, small island. So just imagine when you look at the US and the sheer size, and you're on this half of an island and you're vying for resources. And if you're faced with the butt of a gun or the threat of getting food or paying a tax when you only got $1.25 and you got to give 75 cents up, and you're trying to live because you want to keep your children alive, and you know if you die tomorrow, then your children are abandoned. It's a tough decision. It's a political decision to say, can we quietly pull together? Just like in this country, we saw African Americans rally together. And African Americans lift not only themselves, but lift everybody else too. Every other ethnic group has benefited from the political will of African Americans, and not just ethnic groups, but sexual orientated groups who have benefited from the legislation that others fought very hard. That was a conscious decision. I will say, which is another hard thing, you can't give up on fighting. It is a constant process. You may not have to fight as hard and as intently or on the picket line, but you do have to make sure your voice is always heard. Now, don't get me wrong. I said there were 15 assassinations of political leaders. So this failed state has been going back and forth because of one man, wanting to rule an entire country, be emperors or not. And those who dare to move in the other direction of democracy threaten that individual's wealth. I'll give you another extreme, Russia, Putin. Putin is a de facto dictator, okay, authoritarianly. We have the guise of elections, but he controls everything, all the money and resources in the state. That is the same thing on a micro level that we have seen happen in Haiti without the military and capability and resources to back it up. I still have hope, but if the people don't take it back, it's not likely to happen. And unless gang leaders sit down and suddenly decide to become legitimate, and that is possible, with US influence, with UN influence, to say, hey, let's have a coalition government, which is what was proposed and came into place immediately after the assassination. So we've seen some very positive things happen there, but it can't succeed unless the people and the gang leadership, and right now there is no direct threat to that gang leadership. The importance of migrant versus refugees. They would have had to, and that is also a political label and how you get labeled refugee, migrant. Refugees have political rights and privileges. Migrants do not. And so in this particular case, the argument was that the individuals who had left Haiti had been gone 3 to 5 years, making their way, migrating through Latin America, through Central America, up, and came with some resources, and therefore they were not political refugees. They were economic. Now, you could argue the government has been failed for a long time, so that was their rationale. The same way we rationalize the Afghanis, so refugees who were brought, or the Vietnamese refugees who came in, because of their political relationship and what they were fighting for. If we had seen a cadre, and I'm not saying there aren't, Ms. Pruitt, of political refugees, there probably are, but they have not been able to articulate their message. You see, he or she who can clearly articulate what they're doing and say, this is the reason we left our country, then you stand a better chance of being a political refugee, because you can't take everyone in. So as a country, we have to say, what are the standards and who do we support? And if Haitian Americans as a political base would also raise, and I think many of them have, raised their voices as why it's important to recognize them that way, I don't think you would have seen them put on planes and sent out. Had Afghanis come to this country that way, I'm not sure how we would have dealt with them. Syrians, I think you see finding a harder time coming into this country because they went to Turkey, they went to Europe and trying to get in now. There is also a group of Lebanese in that civil war going on. A good friend of mine's called and said, can you help out? I'm going, what do you mean? There are some Lebanese friends, a friend who wanted to come in the country, but they can't get a visa because the Lebanese people, bureaucrats are charging them $100,000 to get a visa to come to the US. And I said, well, I'm just telling you, one, I can't do anything, but if I were in office and doing it, I would be hard pressed to say no. So I think if we can have, if those, how I'm going to put it, those Haitian refugees were arguing a political reason for why they, Haitian immigrants were doing, they would stand a better chance. And those who are back in Haiti, who are probably trying to articulate that, unfortunately don't have a vehicle or a loud enough vehicle to get their message out. So Haitian Americans really on the political side, and all Americans should be saying that, but you have to have a lobbying group, an action force to do that. I'm sure even some of those missionaries who got US support have been arguing that, but their voices right now aren't loud enough to be heard. So thank you, outstanding questions. I hope I answered, or anything you need me to, I can attempt to clarify.
I think Deanna was next.
Yeah. I believe there were Randolph's are next.
Okay.
I had 2 quick questions, ma'am. One is why Haiti, so Haiti sounds very, hearing your history, it sounds similar to the same things that were going on in Cuba, but Cuba has been so much more stable. And like when I went there, like everything stopped in the 1950s. Like the entire country looks like right out of a 50s movie. But I guess because of their dictatorship, they've been going strong and fine. And so like, is it because there's been kind of no political stability in Haiti that they kind of went off the rails and stayed off the rails because they have had no like one strong dictatorship leadership or no one strong political party? That was my first question. And my second question is, if they're on the same island as Dominican Republic, how is it that it's that vastly different? Like I know there's a huge mountain range that separates them, but why is it so vastly different?
Oh, no, excellent, excellent questions. You're right about Cuba. A political leadership, an ideology that most of the people bought into. Okay, that's important. Remember I talked about political will? Well, that's what you need to have in place. The political will that recognizes and people buying into it. So even the poorest of Cubans believed in the ideology of the state. And the US was the big enemy, okay? It was clear. You had a clear target. And look, don't get me wrong. The Fidel used political repression and violence, but more importantly, he educated a larger portion of his population. He invested in his people. We don't see that same thing happen. It did not happen in Haiti. So Fidel talked about a class struggle. So ideologically, looking at the capitalism as an economic ideology versus democracy and reaching out. Fidel initially reached out to the US, but they wanted Batiste, so their person didn't win. So he said, So Fidel said, well, who is going to help me? And in this case, the Soviet Union, Khrushchev and others said, hey, if we can be in the US backyard or front yard in this case, we will be right there. And so you look at this impact, and from that perspective, you see a people across the board, even though you're stuck in the 50s, and a mistake, and I'm going to say strategic mistake of the US was not to continue to have contact and closing doors, isolation. When those missiles came in, we were really upset, okay? The Cuban Missile Crisis, because the Soviets had missiles that were right there to attack us. Had we even, despite the fact that Cuba had become embraced a communist ideology, kept the door open, we could have had socialism versus communism, or a socialist democracy, which many European countries are, and had that relationship with them. But again, and I'm going to be very ethnocentric, we looked at as a dangerous banana republic. And they underestimated the intellectual capability of Fidel Castro. I always thought Fidel and I would have dinner and, and had a conversation with some great Cuban food and talk about the revolution, and Frida Kahlo would come in from Mexico. I mean, I have my wish list, and I'm totally democracy, but Mao and a whole bunch of people, I would want to have that conversation with them. And Frantz Fanon. So you look at the ideological orientation, and he put his people to work, and he gave opportunities, and they forced themselves to be I would say almost 80% independent in spite of all the embargoes. And if time had to stand still in the 1950s, and look, I will say from a climate change perspective, they've done a hell of a better job than we have. And yes, even without the time of economic support from the fallen Soviet Union to Russia, they have managed to continue. And even in embargoes, they were participating in sending military advisors, health officials to all parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So ideologically, the strength of that leadership, I think while we will see, the Fidel brothers, stepping down from power, I don't think you're going to see this major shift. You also pushed out a class of Cubans who exploited the very people who were there. So, and who lost all their property. And who they go back in today, my assessment is they would attempt to reclaim everything, and they will not be allowed to do that. So that's a different dynamic in place. Haiti did not have a clear-cut ideological orientation that shaped their political, economic, and social development. We had leadership who were looking and invested in their own power and control. And that's pretty blanket, but there are a few exceptions to that, unfortunately. I don't know if I answered your question. Okay. Anyone else? Comments? Or did I scare you all away? Don't get me wrong, I still hope, but without the political, and this goes back to Ms. Pruitt's point, I'm not blaming them, but freedom comes with a very high price tag. Freedom is not free. And if you're not willing to pay the ultimate price, you may not get it, but your children may get it. And so when I look at us as a former free and enslaved people, the political will and the shoulders that we stand on is so enormous. And sometimes we forget, and even with the gangs in the area, but taking a responsibility, even in the poorest situations, to make sure even what education you get, you make the most of it and you go beyond. Having gone to segregated schools from 1st through 7th grade and knew I had hand-me-down books because you could see the white kids' names in the books, I still had outstanding teachers. And it's not an excuse, and it doesn't abdicate anyone else of responsibility, but you first have to educate yourself. And knowing that I stand on the shoulders of so many people, and Lady Pruitt and I had this discussion about, even when I went to undergraduate at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, my parents fought, and others, with the school board to provide a free bus to go to U of L, which was 25 miles away. So I rode the bus 50 miles every day to go to 5 days a week. My brother rode the bus 100 miles round trip to go to Southern University. And that does not a hardship, but it just says, how bad do you want it? And I knew I was a member of a community. And sometimes I would be going to the bus stop, or just on the weekend, some of my mother's friends, my father's friends would shake my hand and slip a little $5 in and say, that's to help you with school. And so that investment in me by them, my investment I just came back from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette for homecoming, because they invited myself and as one who had gone abroad and another local to be honored as alumni there. So the former football player, so it was Mr. Bordelon and me. And so it was in the homecoming parade. And I said, you know what? The janitor who was at the building of where I took my poli-sci courses, I would get there at 6:30 in the morning. And the janitors, like janitors, would open the door so I could go inside. And if it was a hot day and have some air conditioning, if it was a cold day, to go inside. All of those people invested. Those 5 white professors in my political science department, because there were probably 3 of us in the students who were majors in the whole department. And the one history professor invested in me. So it can be people from who you would least expect invest in you. I hung around because I was a commuter with the international students, because I was broadening my horizons. I say all of that is sometimes, even when you have the will and you can live in a tough neighborhood and the gangs take you out. You have done everything you could do. But what is it about that gang member that we didn't turn around? Because the establishment is not likely to do it. So the neighborhood has to decide to take back their neighborhood. And that's a hard one. And so I can, fortunately, when I was growing up, the neighborhood was more economically diverse. So the doctor lived next to you, the school teachers there, and you belonged to everybody. You didn't just belong to yourself. And with upward mobility, our neighborhoods have changed. And the question is, do we go back to our own neighborhoods? And that class divide in Haiti is, also real. There's a large disparity of wealth. Okay. 64% roughly, I'm looking at the stats, of the total wealth in the country belongs to the top 20%. Something like what America is looking at right now in a COVID age. We have shifted, and since Trump, we are shifting in that direction. When you no longer have a middle class or the ability to transition, this is when you go downhill. And so the natural disasters, the growth rate, all of these things, poor leadership. I'm putting poor leadership at the top. Remember, I talked about access to clean water. Well, the health of your community is dependent on access to, unemployment, lack of adequate education. All of those things contribute. And it isn't that people don't want it. I think they've probably reached a point where they just, and this is scary, where you just don't see where it's possible. So even in the United States, in some of our neighborhoods, we have gotten to the point where we just don't believe it's possible. And with COVID, I think I have felt at times, is it possible for me to do more? Am I now stagnant? It doesn't matter how much education you have, what political will, and you get tired of fighting. You just do get tired of fighting. We get weary. And unless you have people lifting you up, both spiritually and physically and intellectually, it can get in this time very, very hard. And I fear for our minority community in terms of education, the lack of access to the internet, the lack of an environment that now they're behind going back to school physically. We have a lot of catching up to do that a year has put us behind, where if you lived in an economically affluent neighborhood, or at least when white middle class people are hurting, can you imagine what's happening to the rest? So I know it's not dire, but it means we have to literally, what are we going to do about it? Not just talk about it. And I know your community is doing it within your church and your neighborhoods. And so you keep lifting. So I knew that while I wasn't back in Opelousas or Lafayette, I needed to keep lifting, and it didn't matter who you was. So if an alumni from my school was coming through, and it so happened in a situation where I was back in Denver, and the man was, probably in his 30s, getting ready to get a master's degree, and he had come to decide whether he was going to go to the Corville school. And he heard me talk, and he said, "Oh, she's from Opelousas." And when I mentioned that, he said, "I have made my decision. I'm coming to the Corville." White guy. And he stayed in touch. And you need a door open, I can open a door, or at least say by name. So we have to continue to lift, but sometimes we don't always lift each other. And again, you never know who's going to open a door. And so never in life did I think George W. Bush 43, was going, because I was a career person in the federal government, going to nominate me as an ambassador. So again, you never know who's going to lift you up. You do the good work, you keep lifting other people, and patrons, you will never know who they are most of the time. Those people in the background who lift you. You don't have to get recognition for lifting someone. So I believe there are still Haitian people who want this. The question is, we have to have enough of a political support group here across the board to say to the government, what are we going to do about Haiti?
Amen. I don't see any more questions. So I want to thank Ambassador Corville once again. Thank you so much for coming and spending the time and talking to us and enlightening us and letting us know more and to getting a better understanding of the things that are happening in Haiti. Because sometimes, you know, we've given to Haiti and we always wonder, right? It seems like they just cannot seem to progress, no matter, you know, how much aid, how much help goes there. They just don't seem to progress, but now we understand some of the reasonings behind it. So we want to thank you again. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. And at this time, I'm going to turn it to the hands of our pastor.
Thank you so much.
Ambassador Haiti, and Ambassador Corville, I could sit and listen to you for the rest of the evening.
Oh,
I know you're friends with Mrs. Pruitt, but I have a poli-sci background.
oh, okay.
I love hearing how you frame and how you paint a parallel between what's happening here in the United States and what's happening in Haiti. I love that. And you said something else. You said that we deserve the government that we get.
Yep.
And I
That's a
hope
hard
us,
pill for me to swallow because I don't like it.
it's the God knows truth. I hope us that have heard this tonight. I don't know how many did or did not vote in the last Virginia gubernatorial election, but it's at the point now where the landscape has changed, and the powers that be, if they don't like the electoral outcome, they can change it. And we sat right here and we watched it.
Absolutely. And African Americans supported Youngkin.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So
Yes.
now, you know, and I'm going to say that the former governor shot himself in the head with that comment about education. So that means take up more of your time. We have to hold Democrats accountable because look, they are no darlings either.
Yep.
Well, I'm on record. I have started a new political party. I'm a holycrat.
I like it. And you can leverage having that information, those dinner time discussions, those small groups, please. If I were taking a little bit from my Soviet, you know, colleagues, politicize and mobilize. You know, this is what you do. Have a clear-cut ideology, a clear-cut end goal, and target. So, you know, that I also, you know, came from a very politically active family of parents who had formal education up to 6th grade, but were the smartest people I know, but were politically aware and politically active, which meant I was politically aware and politically active. And you're never too young. And who know what the government is. The average American doesn't even know how our government works. So one of the things that if your church takes on as a mission is just basic civics education of your congregation, and start with your kids. You know, I'm dating myself. I have a Bill cartoon. Come on. If you have never seen Google, I am a Bill, and that little Bill would come on every Saturday. I'm a Bill.
I'm a Bill.
Capitol Hill.
Yes, I'm only a Bill.
But you know, ingrained.
Yes.
Your kids can understand government now. Watch the news with them. And please don't depend on YouTube and Facebook for your news. It's cringy. There's propaganda. And you have to know the other person's argument to criticize.
Ooh,
That's true.
You cannot criticize poli-sci major what you do not know.
No.
So I apologize, Pastor. I would love to come back and engage. It's a fabulous group. I've enjoyed the groups every time. And, you know, you just give me a little heads up, and if there's an issue, then I'm happy to make time for you all.
I so appreciate it. 2 things, and then I'm going to stop. I learned, or I heard you reinforce tonight that Europeans weren't the first one that started democracies, because it has been taught to us, people of African descent, we just ran around in the jungle. That's been kind of imprinted in our minds. Thank you for that. And then last thing, and then I guess we'll give back to Sister King to dismiss us. Our church, this local church, for years, we have invested and given to support foreign countries. And more than one time, we have raised funds, and I thought we were sending it to Haiti. And it turns out we probably sent it to some gang members who took that money.
Who were political leaders in Haiti and leading the gangs as well.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, you know, those kinds of programs, if you need to be able to clearly identify where the money is going, how it's being used, even with some of the missionaries, if the most of your money goes for their housing and the infrastructure, there is a problem. So I'm willing to give to charities where I know the bulk of the money is going to the people who are actually there. And missionaries that are indigenous usually can have the greatest impact on the internal situation. And I'm not putting down people going out and doing missionary work, but I do think we have to rethink some of that and who gets the money to do it. So I don't want you to stop. I also would encourage you to be more politically active than you already are in leveraging this side of recognizing the importance of Haiti and pushing on the Haitian political leadership. I am truly concerned that if they can't make this shift, and I'm being a little bit redundant here, politically, then all of those factors of climate change and other things will make it nearly impossible. And there's a short window for that to happen. I hope I'm wrong, but you know, my analysis is they gotta make it.
Okay.